Well, another episode of the Square and Compass podcast. This time, I'm very happy to have Chuck Dunning Jr. on. Thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this very much. Thank you, Brother Cameron.
So we got in touch through Esotericon, which I had the pleasure of attending and which you were a presenter at. It's been a little while now, but just talk to us a bit about that. How did you find Esotericon, the virtual format? Just what were your thoughts on Esotericon 2021?
Yeah, I thought that given all of the complications from COVID and the need to adjust and try to find some way to do things uh, with a virtual component, I thought they did a fantastic job at pulling it off. Thankfully, there were enough of the presenters who were vaccinated that we could come to Boston and have a really good time with the conference organizers there. Brian Simmons and all of those guys just do a fantastic job of hosting that event, and I thought the content was good. I really appreciated the opportunity to talk about the future of Freemasonry, which is something that I know is a big topic of concern for lots of Masons, and I thought that things went pretty well. I think we had some technical difficulties, but to some extent, those things are to be expected. On the whole, I was just really happy to have that experience, and I look forward to the next one that Ryan Flynn is going to be running.
Uh, the future of Freemasonry is, probably a topic as old as Freemasonry itself. I'm sure by 1718 they were concerned about the future of Freemasonry. It's a very hard question to answer because it's so broad. But what are your thoughts on the future of Freemasonry?
Yeah, that is a broad question. Well, um, let me start by saying where I think we are presently, because our future is always a consequence of where we are right now. And I think the term that I like to use for what I see happening in the fraternity right now is, I think we're in a renaissance. And for a while, I had been thinking that that was just in the United States, but I've over the past several months, because of all of the internet stuff that has been going on, the Zoom meetings and so on, I've had more of an international experience in Masonry over the past year or so, and I've begun to realize that this Renaissance is bigger than just American Masonry. I think I think the hotbed of the Renaissance is in the United States, but what I mean by a Renaissance is I think that as our numbers decline, one of the things that we're seeing is an opportunity um, to refocus on what Masonry is and what it can be. And when we look at the ritual, Masonry tells us some very clear things about it being this um, initiatic fraternity in which men are supposed to be um, developing virtues, and not just intellectual virtues, not just social virtues, but also spiritual virtues. That all of this is part of the Masonic experience. And so I see this Renaissance really more about Masonry embracing its wholeness, not just focusing on some of the things that it more narrowly focused on in the past, which were fellowship and community service, essentially, were the big two things. And those are good things, but that's not all that Masonry says that it's about. And so I see us moving in the direction of being a smaller fraternity, but one that embraces a more complete vision, about what it is.
the the Renaissance, or to what extent do you think that this change that we're seeing and the Masonic Renaissance, um, is that being driven, do you think, by um, positive forces within the craft, or negative forces within the community that are kind of forcing uh, Mason's hands in a sense? The example I've used a few times when discussing this is, the difference that you see in the World War One and World War Two periods of
Mhm.
Freemasonry, or the post World War One, World War Two, when you had soldiers returning from fighting overseas and filling the lodge ranks basically. But I always pointed out, and I think this is an important thing to consider, is that you didn't see the same increase after the Vietnam War
No,
when
that's true.
sort of returning. And for a long time, I was wondering why that might be. And I think that really ultimately it's these external forces I was discussing is, in the 60s and 70s. And I think to a certain extent, still to this day, those taking different forms, right? You have a distrust in community institutions, a distrust in institutions altogether, and as a result of that, um, you know, maybe to a greater and greater extent, people are just turning away from institutions as a whole,
Mm.
and the result is the reduction of membership and kind of a we almost have to go back to ritual focused work, because it's hard to be a community based organization when people don't trust community based organizations.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think really, um, I think both of the factors that you have mentioned, the external or categories of factors, the external and the internal to the fraternity, are I think we're seeing both of those active in this renaissance. Um, as to which is actually having more of an effect on driving the renaissance, I think it's being shaped more internally, but it's definitely in reaction to the external changes that you're talking about. The fraternity no longer is welcome in society at large in the way that it used to be. Now, I think it's possible that can change, um, but it will change because the community at large sees something desirable about Freemasonry being true to itself, not by Freemasonry trying to make itself look more appealing. Because we've just seen, over the last generation of Masons trying to make adjustments in the fraternity to make it more palatable to a larger percentage of people hasn't done anything to help our membership numbers. That's not the solution to our problem. And in fact, our problem really is not a membership numbers problem. Our problem is a quality problem. And when Masons begin to realize that, as they are, then they work at trying to make the Masonic experience higher quality, more of what it promises to be. If you listen to the ritual tells us what the Masonic experience is supposed to be. And so I think internally, that's what we're seeing is more and more Masons coming forth to try to help bring us to fulfillment of what the ritual says.
Is it? Membership is such a funny. It's such a it's one of those things where it's such a complicated topic, because an outsider looking in, or even your average Mason, would automatically equate a higher membership with success as the main metric. Um, but I think, as we've seen, right, and I think many organizations, not just Freemasons, recognize this. If your only metric for success is the number of names you have on a piece of paper,
Right.
um, that can hide a lot of deficiencies. Uh, to use a sports metaphor, just because you win the game doesn't mean that you played a perfect game. And if you,
Yeah.
I think, reading back some of the history of Freemasonry in Windsor, for example, I think, you can, reading the minutes, reading reports, you can recognize that there are problems even in the 1950s, the 1920s that are cropping up. But because the membership kept increasing, it was very easy to ignore those problems until, as
Right.
with every problem, right? It's easy to ignore until it's not.
Yes. Yes, and I'll use another analogy here that I think is helpful. So a big portion of my career has been spent in higher education, and I have worked for a private institution in higher education. And so some of this applies to public institutions as well. But if you look at higher education, and you look at it from a business perspective, you think, okay, well, the more students the better, because students are paying customers, and the more customers are paying for our services, then the more money we're making and the happier everybody is. The problem is that the quality of the service we provide in higher education tends to go down as our enrollment numbers go up. And the reason for that is you put more students into a classroom with the same number of faculty at the university, you get a lower quality of education for each student, per each student. Students have to work harder to get the attention of their professors and to engage with them and interact with them. And we know that that interaction is a key to their success and their performance. Well, I think that analogy works really well for Freemasonry, where we can have lots of members, but that doesn't help, and in fact actually can impinge upon the quality of their fraternal experience.
Is it possible to have um, Masonic fans as opposed to members? Because that has been, you know, I've been arguing that we don't need to be recruiting, quote unquote, or searching for members per se, but
Mhm.
we do need to, whether a lodge has 10 members or 100 members or 1,000 members, it does need to have a place of prominence and respect in the community. I've used mixed martial arts as an example.
Mm.
I think it's a good one, and it goes to this podcast. Certainly, I hope many Masons tune in to this and watch this and get something out of it for their Masonic career. But I certainly hope, and to make this economically viable, you need non-Masons who find this of interest and tune in and watch this. And you know, uh, uh, mixed martial arts, UFC, for example, it doesn't advertise itself only to other mixed martial artists,
Mhm.
right? You have an entire, well, stadium or millions of people engaged in UFC,
Mhm.
and a percentage of those then decide, you know what, I want to actually try this, and they go to a gym, and then a percentage of those become the next, Poirier McGregor, become the next one of the big ones. And I think with Freemasonry, yes, there are things that we can't or we shouldn't share because it dilutes the experience. Certainly, we don't want to be sharing secrets, but that doesn't mean that Freemasonry can't form community partnerships. It doesn't mean Freemasons can't find people who want to support the craft and maybe not be a member. Maybe they own a business and they want to link up with the Masonic Temple to provide services to the temple or whatever it
Mhm.
is. And I think that goes to this idea of, instead of focusing on, oh, hey, there's John Smith, we need to get a membership application in his hand. It can be, hey, there's John Smith, I wonder if he'd be interested in if he's a cook or something, and helping us out for refreshment hour or touring the building, or the classic example is the Windsor Masonic Temple. When it was built in 1921, there were thousands of people there to see it be built,
Mhm.
and most of those weren't Masons, right? They were
Yeah.
there, but they supported the idea of Masonic Temple because it meant, if you had a Masonic Temple in your town, it meant your town was on the map and was a
Mhm.
relevant place in this country. So I guess it's one thing to focus solely on membership, which I don't think we should be doing, but to focus on the dignity and reputation of the craft, I think is an area we could go.
Yeah, I like what you just said, the dignity and reputation of the craft. And and I think that it does make sense to think about how we address the dignity and reputation of the craft organizationally, institutionally. What can we do as an organization, whether it's a lodge or a grand lodge? Um, but I think even more important than that is individual Masons um, really working hard to fulfill the vision of Masonry in their own life. To be a kind of human being that when other human beings encounter them, they go, "Wow, that's a different person," and in a positive way, right? That's a person who uh, is dignified, who has a very positive reputation. Someone who is an exemplar of the virtues that we laud in Freemasonry. And I think that those kinds of things really do much more for the fraternity as a whole, both internally and in terms of the way we're perceived by other people, than a lot of the public stuff. I don't know how it is in your jurisdiction, but in my jurisdiction, one of the first things that happens with an entered apprentice is we put them in the northeast corner of the lodge and we talk about them being the cornerstone, and how important it is for them to think of themselves as a cornerstone. And just think about all of the symbolism of the cornerstone and how it's supposed to be perfect and how it's supposed to be consecrated and its significance to the building. And so I think there's a lot of emphasis in our ritual on we really need to be working on those individuals, and that if we do that, well, then the organizational and institutional stuff will arise out of that.
What are your thoughts? And I actually talked about this with uh, oh, I can't think of his name now. Our brother from North Carolina. But it's an episode. I'll link it when I can remember the name. Matt Parker. There you go, Matt Parker.
Matt Parker's a good friend of mine.
He's good people, very good people,
Yes, he is.
very good Mason. So you mentioned Freemasons who have um, disparage the craft in some way, either because they are committing criminal offenses or just shady business practices or whatever it is. Matt Parker talked about in North Carolina they do background checks on applicants.
Yes.
And, I spent most of my professional career in the criminal justice system. I was a probation officer, and then I worked in a jail on the rehabilitation side. Rehabilitation is one of those words. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But
Yeah.
basically, on the side that was working with them upon release or as they were getting ready to be released from
Mm-hmm.
the institution. I've always wondered the appropriate steps or how a Masonic lodge should deal with, either a brother who commits a criminal act or is charged with something but maybe not found guilty. Because on the one hand, you have the reputation and dignity of the craft to consider,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but wearing my professional hat, all the evidence I've seen, and I tend to believe it, would indicate that if you don't want somebody to reoffend or if you want somebody to change their behavior, community engagement is one of the things, and community engagement and employment seem to be the two things most likely to
Mm-hmm.
encourage good behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So, if somebody is either disqualified from the craft or removed from the craft for criminal activities and not brought back in, um, I don't know how I feel about it. I recognize why it would be done, but I can also see the danger of of that from a perspective of, that's only going to encourage the behavior you would hopefully want to stop, right?
Yeah.
Unless the person is going to spend the rest of his life in jail. um, there has to be a way to reintegrate into the community. Otherwise, you're just setting up for failure. But I don't know. That's just something that came up with Brother Parker. So, any thoughts on your side of the world?
Well, I agree with you. Um, I Yes, I understand that rehabilitation means different things to different people, but in general, I will say that I think rehabilitation is much more effective in helping individuals and in helping communities than punishment is. Um, Sometimes I guess punishment is necessary, but let's look at this from a Masonic perspective. If we've done our diligence in in determining whether someone is fit for membership in our fraternity, whether or not there's a good match there, then once we bring them in, we have a responsibility to that brother. And and if he doesn't live up to the virtues and the values of Freemasonry in some way, our ritual tells us that we have a responsibility to work with him to try to help him uh, improve, to try to help him make himself a better man. Um, we have to make that effort. If we don't make that effort, if we just say, okay, you've committed a Masonic offense, you're out of here. If that's our only solution, then we're not really living up to what our ritual says we should be doing. Now, of course, he has to be ready, willing, and able to accept help and to try to do something with the help that he's given. And if he doesn't do that, if he demonstrates that he's not ready, willing, and able, then then it may be the only thing that is appropriate is for him to suffer the consequences of the full consequences of his actions, and that may be the only lesson that is left to help him learn. But there's a lot of things that can be done before you get to that point, and so I wonder sometimes if uh, if it's just something that has changed with the change in our culture, or whether or not this has always been one of those things that Masons deal with. Because we can look back into the past of Masonry and we can see that there have been some pretty unsavory characters who were Masons and famous Masons, and yet um, I still want to think, this is maybe some nostalgia on my part, but I still want to think in past times, Masons were better about giving each other good counsel, about calling each other on their lapses in virtue, and reminding each other of the support that was available to them to try to deal with whatever it was that they needed to deal with and work out whatever they needed to work out. Um, so so there is a two-way street there. It really isn't just about whether the individual Mason can live up to the vision that Masonry provides. It's also about whether his brothers can help him do that.
The the idea of good counsel and Masons providing a counsel to one another, is that I wonder, the extent to which that's even possible in 2021, in the sense of, the social media, like the divisions that we're seeing in the world are not staying in the world, right? They're making it to all sorts of
Mhm.
organizations and institutions, and um, it does seem harder to provide any type of counsel at all, because there's so many different groups and organizations that are online where a Mason can say X to somebody, but then that Mason can go online and find um, even something, it could be innocuous. Uh, you know, uh, I've discovered a scary number of Freemasons, for example, who seem to think the Earth is flat. Uh, and if anybody watching this thinks the Earth is flat, leave a comment, I guess. But that's one of those things where how do you provide, counsel in that case?
Yeah,
Because as soon as you're done, they're just going to go online to wherever it is they learned the earth is flat.
yeah.
And I just think that's one of the challenges that we have is, and this is for the world, but in Freemasonry, like there seems to be almost no commonality of experience or purpose or facts anymore. You can
Hmm.
go up and down the list, right? Vaccines,
Yeah.
politics, the shape of the earth. And I think that's one thing that a lot of groups and Masons are struggling with is, if you can't even agree on the shape of the earth, how
Hmm.
exactly do you agree on anything else?
Right. Yeah. And I think that that's actually a question that has been at the core of Masonry for a very long time. I mean, you think about Anderson's constitutions, and and in those constitutions, it says that Masonry was meant to be a center of union among men who would otherwise never have come together. That they set their religious and political differences aside to focus on what it means to be a virtuous human being. That there's something more universal about that than there is about politics and religion. Now, of course, even today, even you know that can be brought into question. But here's one of the things that I notice about Freemasonry. There are Masons that I currently know and cherish in my life that I have some really significant political differences with. Um, and and if our relationship were to become focused on political differences, um, then we might never talk with each other again. However, we also happen to have some really strong agreement, at least on the ideal of what it means to be a virtuous human being. And, and where we diverge is how those virtues work out politically. But they don't diverge as much on how we deal with each other individually. So here again, we go back to that individual level. And one of the things that social media has done to us is it's become a substitute for developing, building, and nurturing real, healthy relationships with people outside of our own families and sometimes even within our own families. And this is one of the reasons why being involved in that person to person experience of the fraternity is so important, is because it gives us an opportunity to build real friendships with people who are very different from us. And social media theoretically, hypothetically offers that opportunity. But in fact, when we look at the way people use social media, it doesn't tend to actually work that way. So I really like what I see in the craft about this hunger to get back to meeting face to face. I think we instinctively know that that's something that we need. Now, about your point on offering good counsel and how it intersects with this importance of developing face to face relationships, real face to face relationships, friendships with other men, human beings who are different from us. So, my career is in the overlap of higher education and mental health. And one of the things that we deal with in mental health a lot is the question of how effective is it to actually confront another human being with something that they're doing that seems unhealthy or unwise or harmful in some way. And the research on this shows that being confrontational really doesn't help much. That what helps is developing a real relationship with another human being. And then at some point, you develop the kind of trust in there so that you can, rather than challenging them in a kind of aggressive way, you point out or you ask a question about, what's going on with your life here? How does that fit with your values? And so you are kind of confronting them, but in a way that is is not threatening. And so I think that there's an art to good counsel that uh, that we could develop more effectively if we focus on what it means to really be brothers with each other, to actually have that brotherly love with each other, to actually practice relief with each other. And then we can bring in some of those elements of truth and have difficult conversations that aren't just about defending positions against each other.
You brought up the idea of uh, an emphasis on virtue, or being virtuous.
Mhm.
Certainly, that is one of the Masonic principles, which we try to emulate, or try to um, grow within ourselves, cultivate within ourselves. But it's always one of those. It's like rehabilitation in a sense, right? It can mean a lot of different things. You know, the great irony of the world is no one ever views themselves as acting in a non-virtuous manner, right? Pick your worst person in history. I'm sure that he or she felt that they were acting virtuously. So I guess, how do you define first? How do you define a virtue? But then also, do you think it's possible for an individual to be sufficiently aware of himself to, in the moment, to recognize whether he's acting virtually or not virtually? It's always possible to look back. I know, and many
Yeah.
people, myself included, haven't. And that was dumb. That was not a good way to act. But
Yeah.
how in a moment does one take stock and consider the question of whether or not his actions are virtuous? And specifically, how does a Mason do so?
Yeah, those are great questions, Cameron. You're right. There are lots of different ways to define virtue, but one of my favorite ways goes all the way back to Aristotle. And Aristotle said that a virtue is in the mean between two extremes. So, for example, the virtue of fortitude is in the mean between the extreme of anger or rage on one hand, rashness, and on the other hand, the um, the extreme of cowardice. And so virtue is always about striking a balance between too much and too little of whatever it is. And of course there's a range in there to try to find what is ideal, and that's going to differ from one person to another. But I think one of the things that you kind of pointed at that is super important here is to understand that we are social beings. In my jurisdiction, there's language in the Fellowcraft degree on the sense of hearing, and there's language in the Master Mason's degree on the beehive that emphasize the importance of recognizing that we are social beings, that our best potentials cannot manifest outside of being part of a community. And an important part of the community experience is people reflecting back to us things that we don't necessarily see about ourselves. Seeing ourselves through the eyes of other people is hugely important in community, or is an important benefit of community. And so if we have this idea that being virtuous is about being this super independent character who decides for oneself what is right and what is wrong in all cases, well, yes, we each bear the responsibility for that decision, but an important factor in that decision is the other people, or factors are the other people and the relationships that we have with them.
The Yeah, I think that was Aristotle's idea as well. right? The idea that part of how you define yourself has to be based on the community around you and your relationships, right? You can't define yourself purely based on however it is you may be feeling in a moment. You also have to create an identity based at least in part on your relationships with others and
Yes.
kind of where it is that how it is that you fit to the community
Right.
is at least partially going to set up an identity for you. Probably that's probably more so the case, I would think, than actually individually, just because we're such social creatures. Even an introvert, from an evolutionary perspective, right? We wouldn't have made it out of the caves if not for our social bonding, because we certainly are not going to make it on our own.
That's
Uh,
right.
so maybe that's one of the ways in which Freemasonry as a recognition of that necessity of having a group and being able to form an identity, at least in part from relationships.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. To a certain extent, um, there's a kind of illusion of the term rugged individualism is popular among certain people, and and some people love to bash that term, and other people love to embrace that term. But the idea of an individual who doesn't acknowledge the um, the fact that they live in interdependence with other human beings, um, that's uh, that's actually that's actually a dysfunction to think that way. It's an illusion. It's a delusion to think that my actions and my decisions are completely separate and isolated from other individuals. And one of the great things about Freemasonry is it can help break down that illusion. I mean, if you think about our mythology, the idea of the temple being built, nothing in Freemasonry symbolism um, about building temples can be done without the cooperation, the collaboration, the teamwork, the interdependence, not only of different human beings, but human beings with different specialties, carpenters and stonemasons. And, it, so masonry itself is deeply rooted in this idea that we are communal beings.
Now, focusing, moving from Freemasonry in general to your work in particular, and your involvement not just with Esotericon but your researches. Tell us a little bit about a contemplative builder, what it is, the different things that you worked on, and also how uh, anyone, but Masons in particular, where they can find your work.
Okay. So one of the things that I came into the fraternity looking for was was what I had found in researching for Freemasonry before I joined. And that is looking at the ritual, looking at what a lot of the great Masonic philosophers have said about Freemasonry. I saw this emphasis on a contemplative dimension within Freemasonry, that there was an initiatic experience, that it offered initiatic experiences. And along with that, it encouraged a contemplative life, a life that integrated being profoundly internal, looking within oneself to know thyself, right? The inscription on the Temple of Delphi in ancient Greece, the key to the ancient mysteries, according to Socrates, um, that it incorporated that with a virtuous life of action in the world, and that the two complemented each other, that you really cannot develop yourself as an individual without being engaged in the world, and you really can't make a positive difference in the world without really being fully engaged internally. So that's what I wanted. And because of my background in in studies of philosophy and in mental health, I was already practicing contemplative methods like meditation and mindfulness. And so I was really hopeful that when I came into the fraternity, I would find brothers who had similar interests and that, I would have that kind of a community experience. That's not what I found. What I found was Masons who were really interested in those two things of just fellowship, which is a good thing, and doing some good stuff for the community, like providing scholarships for high school students. Those are good things. Um, but I could have, if that's what I had been looking for, I could have gotten that any number of other places. What I really was looking for were these contemplative and spiritual, philosophical aspects that I had found in my studies. Well, what I determined at that point was that, and after doing lots of searching and digging and reaching out in different directions, this was in 1988, by the way, when I started as a Mason, that those things were really, really hard to find. And so I determined at that point that my work in Freemasonry would be to offer to others those things that I had been looking for because I already had some resources to help provide them. And in sometime in the early 2000s, I developed a real close friendship with Brother Robert Davis and Brother Jim Tresner in Guthrie, Oklahoma, the Scottish Rite Valley in Guthrie, Oklahoma, and they both were engaged in masonry in the way that I wanted to be, and that eventually led to me becoming the director of education for the Guthrie Valley of the Scottish Rite in 2011. And and they encouraged me to begin offering contemplative practice, meditation sessions during our reunions for those Masons who wanted the same kind of experience that I had wanted when I came in. And we started getting more brothers showing up. And the next thing you know, those brothers are saying, we really ought to have some sort of official recognition within the fraternity that we exist and that we have a purpose and that we bring something beneficial to the Masonic experience. And that led to the creation of the Academy of Reflection, which was chartered in 2012. So you can see that it was a really quick development there. And and the Academy of Reflection officially started operation in 2013. And so, what the Academy of Reflection is a society of Scottish Rite Freemasons who are interested in contemplative practice. And so, we offer courses in contemplative practice as well as fellowship among Masons who have those interests. And then that in time encouraged me to published the book Contemplative Masonry, which I had originally released around in the year 2000 as an anonymous manuscript online, a downloadable manuscript online. I expanded it and edited it and turned it into a book, and that was published in 2016. And that led to all sorts of speaking engagements and going around and providing training sessions in contemplative practice, facilitating retreats for Masons and other esoteric groups in contemplative practice. It led to me being invited to help create the Masonic Legacy Society and all of the things that it does, for which I'm currently one of the trainers. Um, and and I've got another book coming out called The Contemplative Lodge. I'm working on two more books that will be coming out in future years. I've still got to get that second book out, which should be coming out this summer. And I've got this website, um, well, a YouTube channel called the Contemplative Builder YouTube channel, which you referred to, where I've got different videos of my presentations, audio interviews, guided meditations that people can use. I've got a website at chuckdunning.com. So lots of stuff out there. I've been a busy guy.
I
Good
will
deal.
leave links to all of those things down below in the description. So check all those things out. Subscribe to his YouTube channel. I'll leave it as a featured channel on my page. Yeah, I've had a chance to interview. I have some different guests from Legacy Society.
Mhm,
Randy Sanders. I'm
mhm.
actually currently in Missouri, so I've had the chance to see him in person for the first time. I've seen him on screen a bunch of times.
Yeah.
Matt Parker I had on, right? He's involved with Refracted Light, and um, yeah, it's great to see the engagement of so many brothers from you know St. Louis, North Carolina. I've interviewed brethren who are involved in this from Lexington,
Mhm.
Kentucky. John Bizak wrote Sins of Our Masonic Fathers. So there is, you know, you mentioned the Masonic Renaissance. You really just have you are seeing all over the United States, especially perhaps spurred on a bit by virtual and the ability for these brethren in different places to meet. Um, you are really seeing just a growth of some of these ideas, like you discussed, and manuscripts being published, webinars being posted. So it's been great to see, and it's great to have so many of these Masons, such as yourself, on the podcast.
Mm. Yeah, I can imagine how rewarding it is for you. Sometimes I think uh, podcasting might be a good thing to do, but I don't know that my temperament is suited for it. I'm more of an introvert, and and so when I look at the kind of work that you do and other podcasters and the opportunity to have such great conversations and share those, uh, with an audience of all of these different Masons and their different approaches to how we can help improve the Masonic experience, how we can help this Renaissance occur. Some Masons not even thinking in terms of the Renaissance, but that's what they're helping. They're helping that happen. I just think that that's a really interesting and cool thing to do, and I love to be a witness of it. My work is in different directions, but I really appreciate the kind of thing that you're doing, Cameron.